Now the author rahimahullah is going to go on to talk about the shurut al-sihha. And so he says, وَمِن شُرُوتِ الصِّحَّةِ الصَّوْمِ. Yani, here he's going to mention the conditions for soundness, which means he's going to mention those things that have to be present in order for a person's fast to be sound. So these are the conditions of soundness, meaning the conditions that have to be met in order for a person's fast to be sound. The first one, he says, النية السابقة للفجر سواء كان فردا أو نفلا. He says, النية السابقة للفجر, having the intention that precedes the fajr, meaning that in order for a person to have a sound fast, he must have the niyyah that he's going to fast before the fajr comes in, which means if a person, technically speaking, were to sleep at night and then wake up in the day time, or were to go to sleep at night without the niyyah to fast and then woke up in the daytime and did not find any food in his house and said, okay, I'm going to fast the rest of the day, technically speaking, that would not be considered a fast, even if he insisted on abstaining from food, because the condition for a sound fast is that the niyyah has to be made before Fajr. And before Fajr doesn't mean that it has to be done right before Fajr. It means that a niyyah for the following day, to fast for the following day, can be done anytime after Maghrib, before the following Fajr. And he says, سواء كان فردا أو نفلا, and regardless of if it's a fard fast, a wajib fast, or a nafila fast, all of it has to be preceded by a niyyah that occurs before Fajr occurs. And then he says, وَالنِّيَّةُ الْوَاحِدَةُ كَافِيَةٌ فِي كُلِّ صَوْمٍ يَجِبُ تَتَابُعُهُ كصيام رمضان والصيام كفارة الظهار والقتل والنذر الذي أوجبه المكلف على نفسه. Here he's mentioning what we talked about before, that one niyyah, that having one niyyah at the beginning of Ramadan is sufficient for all of Ramadan, under the condition that it is that there is no breaking of the obligation. So, in other words, any fast of more than one day that is obligatory, then one niyyah from the beginning of that fasting day, or from the beginning of the first day of that fast, will be sufficient for the rest of the fast. So, for example, in Ramadan, if one makes a niyyah at the beginning of Ramadan, it is sufficient for a person to use that same niyyah for all of Ramadan, as long as something does not occur that necessitates that the fast is no longer obligatory. And we gave the example of a woman who's menstruating or a person who's traveling. But he also goes on to mention kasiyam Ramadan, and I just gave you examples like fasting in Ramadan was siyam kafarat al-zihar, yani also fasting the kafarat al-zihar, which is a specific type of a divorce, which we won't go into detail here. But when a person divorces his wife by a zihar, then it is, if he cannot find a slave, if he wants to go back to his wife after this specific type of divorce is made, then he must free a slave. For example, that's the original rule, that he must free a slave. But if he cannot find a slave, then he's obligated to fast 2 months before trying to return back to his wife. So that the fasting for the 2 months here is obligatory. And so if he makes the niyyah at the beginning, then he doesn't have to make a new fast for the whole 2 months, because that fasting is obligatory. Another fasting that's obligatory is waqatli, wakifarat al-qatli. Kafarat al-qatli is when a person kills somebody by mistake, by an accident. They're requested to free a slave, and if they do not have a slave, then they are requested to fast shahraini, 2 months as well, and that fasting 2 months consecutively is obligatory. So if he makes the intention to fast at the beginning of the day, at the beginning of the first fast, then that will be considered sufficient. وَالنَّذْرِ, and then he mentions وَالنَّذْرِ الَّذِي أَوْجَبُهُ الْمُكَلَّفُ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ. Nadri, as we mentioned before, swearing by something. For example, the person said, I swear by Allah that in June I'm going to fast for a whole month. Then in this case, at the beginning of June, when he makes his niyyah, then it is not obligatory for him to make a niyyah for every other day, because the fast is fasting consecutively, day after day, is obligatory. Therefore, one niyyah is sufficient. And then he says, وَأَمَّا الصِّيَامُ الْمَسْرُودُ وَالْيَوْمُ الْمُعَيِّنُ فَلَا بُدَّ مِنَ التَّبْيِيتِ فِيهِ كُلَّ لَيْلَةٍ. He says, وَأَمَّا الصِّيَامُ الْمَسْرُودُ. What he means by masrud, al-masrudu, meaning the consecutive fasts, fasting consecutively, but for nafila purposes. For example, a person who just has the intention to fast Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. That's a siyam al-masrud. Then that person would have to make a niyyah each day, because in this case, the fasting these 3 days consecutively is not obligatory. Therefore, he has to make a niyyah for each day. وَالْيَوْمُ الْمُعَيَّنُ. وَالْيَوْمُ الْمُعَيَّنُ, for example, a person who always has the norm or the custom of fasting every Wednesday. Every time Wednesday comes around, he has to make a new niyyah, and even if he's if he's doing it more than once, as I mentioned, as it's a custom, it's not sufficient, because because the fasting that he's doing every Wednesday it's not obligatory that it's done consecutively. So therefore, he has to make the niyyah every time he's going to do it. So he says, فَلَا بُدَّ مِنَ التَّبْيِيتِ فِيهِ كُلَّ لَيْلَةٍ, and thus it is obligatory on him to make the niyyah at the night. That's what tabyit means, to make the niyyah to intend to fast, fi kulla laylatin, in every night. And then he mentions, it goes on, other things from shurut al-sihha, and he mentions, وَمِن شُرُوطِ صِحَّةِ الصَّوْمِ النَّقَاءُ مِن دَمِ الْحَيْضِ وَالنِّفَاسِ, that a person be free from menses and nifas. So which means that if a woman in the state of menses and a woman in the states of menses or postnatal bleeding, then just as she is not obligated to fast, her fast wouldn't be sound even if she were to fast. So in reality, an-naqa'u is from shurut al-sihha, and it's also from shurut al-wujub. And what do we mean by shurut al-wujub? Those things that have to be there in order for the fast itself to be obligatory. So for a woman to be in the state of fasting, she's not obligated to fast, nor will it be sound if she were to do it. Then he says, فَإِنْ انْقَطَعَ دَمُ الْحَيْضِ وَالنِّفَاسِ قَبْلَ الْفَجْرِ وَلَوْ بِلَحْظَةٍ وَجَبَ عَلَيْهَا صَوْمُ ذَلِكَ وَلَوْ لَمْ تَغْتَسِلْ إِلَّا بَعْدَ الْفَجْرِ. Here's another important point that women should not get mixed up, that the ending of menstruation and making ghusl are two different things. So what he says here is that if فَإِنْ انْقَطَعَ دَمُ الْحَيْضِ وَالنِّفَاسِ, if the menstruation blood were to stop, and or the postnatal bleeding were to stop, قبل الفجر, before the fajr, ولو بلحظة, even if by a moment before fajr, وجب عليها صوم ذلك اليوم, it is obligatory for her to fast that day, ولو لم تغتسل, even if she didn't make the ghusl. So the fact that she didn't make the ghusl doesn't matter. As long as she's not menstruating, then she's obligated to fast. So just the point of menses that has to be understood, that it is obligatory in the Malikiyah for a woman to check her menses for every prayer. So in this case, what we're concerned with is fajr. So it is obligatory for a woman sometime during the time of fajr to check to see if she's menstruating, to know whether or not she has to pray fajr or not. But in the case of fasting, it is not obligatory for her to wake up and look to see if she's bleeding before fajr. So understand the difference. She is not requested to wake up before fajr to check to see if she's still bleeding, to see if she has to fast or not. This mas'ala is just in regards to the case when a woman were to see that she finished fasting before Fajr came in. The reason why he mentions this mas'ala is because some women might think if she were to stop bleeding, but she didn't make a ghusl, then she wouldn't have to fast. So he's only clarifying the point that she would have to fast because all that matters is that she's not menstruating and that she's not in the state of postnatal bleeding. Then he says, وَتُعَادُ النِّيَّةُ إِذَا انْقَطَعَ التَّتَابُعُ بِالْمَرَضِ وَالْحَيْضِ وَالنِّفَاسِ وَالشِّبْهِ ذَلِكَ. This is another important point that I mentioned to you before. As we mentioned again, that if the fasts that are obligatory to be fasted consecutively, if they're broken by something that necessitates that the fasting is no obligatory, when that thing is removed and the fasting in Ramadan becomes obligatory again, they must make the new niyyah. That's obligatory. That's why it says وَتُعَادُ النِّيَّةُ. Then they have to repeat the niyyah إِذَا انْقَطَعَ التَّتَابُعُ. If the consecutive fasting is cut بالمرض, by sickness or menstruation or nifas, وَشِبْهِ ذَلِكَ, and anything that is like that. What does it mean? All he's doing is giving you examples of those things that break the obligation of fasting, so that when the obligation returns, it is obligatory for the person to make a new niyyah before continuing their fast. وَمِن شُرُوطِ صِحَّةِ الصَّوْمِ, and also from the things that are obligatory during Sawm, which is the third one, al-aqlu, يعني having mental ability. فَمَنْ لَا عَقْلَ لَهُ كَالْمَجْنُونِ وَالْمُغْمَى عَلَيْهِ لَا يَصِحُّ مِنْهُ الصَّوْمُ فِي ذَلِكَ الْحَالَةِ. So he says, an example, فَمَنْ لَا عَقْلَ لَهُ, whoever doesn't have mental stability or comprehension, كَالْمَجْنُونِ, a person who is possessed by a jinn, for example, وَالْمُغْمَى عَلَيْهِ, or a person who was fainted, who fainted, for example, fainted after Maghrib and is still faint. لا يصح منه الصوم في ذلك الحالة. Then his fasting wouldn't be considered sound. Right? So for example, a person before Fajr was began to faint, for example, or fainted. Or a person who was affected by a jinn when the time of Fajr came in, then the fast would not be considered sound, because al-aqlu, meaning mental awareness, is considered a condition for the soundness of prayer. For the soundness of the fast. And that's why it says وَيَجِبُ عَلَى الْمَجْنُونِ إِذَا عَادَ إِلَيْهِ عَقْلُهُ وَلَوْ بَعْدَ السِّنِينَ كَثِيرَةٍ أَنْ يَقْضِيَ مَا فَاتَهُ مِنَ الصَّوْمِ فِي حَالِ جُنُونِهِ وَمِثْلُهُ الْمُغْمَى عَلَيْهِ إِذَا فَاقَ. That's why it says here, in this case, since they weren't awake during the fast, they didn't have the mental awareness, it is obligatory for them to make that fast up. They have to make qada after Ramadan. That's why it says وَيَجِبُ عَلَى الْمَجْنُونِ. It is obligatory on the majnoon إِذَا عَادَ إِلَيْهِ عَقْلُهُ, when his mental awareness comes back, وَلَوْ بَعْدَ السِّنِينِ كَثِيرَةٍ, even if it's after many years, and يَقْضِيَ مَا فَاتَهُ, to make up those fasts that missed him min as-sawm fi hal jununihi, while he was in the state of being possessed by a jinn, for example. وَمِثْلُهُ الْمُغْمَى عَلَيْهِ, and the same thing goes for the person who had fainted, إِذَا أَفَاقَ, once he wakes up. Then he goes on to the next thing, was saying وَمِن شُرُوطِ صِحَّةِ الصَّوْمِ تَرْكُ الْجِمَاعِ وَالْأَكْلِ وَالشُّرْبِ, the abstaining from sexual intercourse and eating and drinking. فَمَنْ فَعَلَ فِي نَهَارِ رَمَضَانَ شَيْئًا مِنْ ذَلِكَ مُتَعَمِّدًا مِنْ غَيْرِ تَأْوِيلِ الْقَرِيبِ وَلَا جَهْلٍ فَعَلَيْهِ الْقَضَاءُ وَالْكَفَّارَةُ. Okay, here's the important thing. we've been talking about recently is making up the missed prayer. But here we're going to talk about making up the missed fast. But here we're going to talk about making up the missed fast and paying the penalty of kafara. In our school, paying the penalty of kafara. Kafara is when a person eats or drinks or has sexual intercourse intentionally. Intentionally. A person who intends to do that intentionally, he'll have to make up that day of fasting, and he'll have to pay the penalty of kafara, which we will define shortly. So he says, فَمَنْ فَعَلَ, meaning فَمَنْ فَعَلَ, whoever does one of these three things, فِي نَهَارِ Ramadan, in the daytime of Ramadan, شَيْئًا مِنْ ذَلِكَ مُتَعَمِّدًا, that he did it intentionally, not if he did it forgetfully. Because if a person were to have sexual intercourse or eating or drinking out of forgetfulness, then they would only have to make up that prayer. They would only have to make up that fast, but they wouldn't have to make up kafara. And he says, مِنْ غَيْرِ تَعْوِيلٍ قَرِيبٍ وَلَا جَهْلٍ. And that is under the condition that person is going to have to make kafara, under the condition that they didn't do it with a valid interpretation or a valid interpretation. Understand what this point means here and why it's very important, because we have two different types of people who do it intentionally. Some people do it intentionally because they had a misunderstanding, and then there's people who do it intentionally because they did it intentionally. People who did it intentionally, purely intentionally, they're gonna have to make kafara. But the people who did it with a sensible excuse, for example, a person who was fasting, and here's a valid excuse of a person who did it intentionally. A person they started traveling, and they thought that they reached the distance of a traveler, and so they thought it was permissible for them to break their fast, and it was permissible for them to break their fast. But then they found out that they didn't travel the distance. They made a mistake in their understanding of distance, meaning that they thought they traveled a certain amount of distance, but they didn't travel that. They traveled less, which technically speaking, they weren't considered travelers. Then in that case, they would be excused, so they would only have to make qada and not kafara. Or another example would be a woman who her menses stopped, but she thought because Fajr came in and she didn't make a ghusl yet that she didn't have to fast, because she didn't have enough time to make ghusl before the time of Fajr came in. She'll have to make qada, but she won't have to make kafara because her misunderstanding would be accepted. Now the next one that he mentions is wala jahlin. For example, a person who did it out of ignorance, and the example that they give, what they mean out of ignorance, doesn't mean any Muslim who does it out of ignorance, because as we mentioned before, Muslims are expected to know the things that are fard ayn. When we say out of ignorance, we're referring to a person who is new to Islam. They call him hadith ahdin. A person who is new to Islam, who didn't know that he couldn't have sexual intercourse, for example. So, for example, he became Muslim. The people, they told him about fasting, but he didn't know that he couldn't have sexual intercourse, or so on and so forth. Or he really thought that he had to fast, but only fast enough but if he became very hungry, then he can have a glass of water, for example. Then that person, although they would be obligated to make qada, they wouldn't be obligated to make kafara. Then he says, فَعَلَيْهِ الْقَضَاءُ وَالْكَفَارَ. Then it is obligatory on this person that we mentioned who did it intentionally. It is obligatory for them to make qada and kafara. So going back, just to seal up this point so it's clear, the person who does something muta'ammidan intentionally, without any acceptable excuse, and understand that an acceptable excuse is not something that you and me assume to be an acceptable excuse. The acceptable excuses are mentioned by numbers in the books of fiqh, and I gave you an example of the traveler and the one of the menstruating woman. So it's not for me and you to assume, well, this is a valid excuse and this is not a valid excuse. This is something technical and is covered in the books of fiqh. So if that person were to do this thing intentionally without any valid excuse or misunderstanding, or he wasn't a new Muslim who did it out of ignorance for not knowing something, then this is where a person's going to make qada and kafara along with the qada. Then he's going to mention what kafara is. Wal kafaratu fi dhalika kullihi it'amu sittina miskinan muddan li kulli مسكين بمد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو أفضل وله أن يكفر بعتق رقبة مؤمنة أو بالصيام شهرين متتابعين. In our school, kafara, which means it's a penalty that a person pays for breaking their fast intentionally without a valid excuse, is to feed 64 people 1 mud. لكل miskinin. A mud is bimuddin Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. In our school, the meaning of a mud is 4 handfuls of food. And how do we determine a handful? By putting our 2 hands together, not opening them too far and not closing them too close together. Just the way like you put your hands together to scoop water. Not too much closed and not too much open. This is 4 of these is considered. One of these is considered a mud, meaning a handful. So one of these, a person is obligated to feed a person 60 people 1 mud of food. So a handful of rice to 60 different poor people. And you cannot feed the same person twice, right? And so what people don't understand is they say that they can't find 60 poor people. But the reason why this penalty is given is because a person who breaks their fast intentionally has to work hard to repay it up. So you can't just say, take the 60 muds together and then just go give it to one person. That would be too easy, right? That would be too easy. Everybody would then, break their fast intentionally if they knew that all they had to do was do that. But when you have to try to find 60 people and feed them a handful of food, or even more, the handful is the least amount, then a person will take, breaking his fast intentionally serious. So that's what it means when it says it'amu sittina miskinan, to feed 60 poor people, muddan, 1 mud, which means a scoop with 2 hands of food. Likulli miskinin, which means it has to only be 1 handful for each person. So if you were to give 2 or 3 to one person, then the second and the third one wouldn't count. Bimuddin Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam wa huwa afdalu. In our school, it is considered the best thing to do, as opposed to the other 2 things that I'm going to mention. Walahu an yukaffira bi'itqi rakabatin mu'minatin. And the second one is that a person can pay his kafara by freeing a slave. Aw bi siyami shahraini mutatabi'aini, or by fasting 60 consecutive months. 60 consecutive days, or 2 months to be more exact. So either a person can feed 60 people, which he mentions here is the best thing to do. All right? So there's no obligation to do one over the other. In some other schools, it's obligatory to fast the 2 months first, and it is only permissible to go to the other things if one doesn't have the ability to complete the fast, and I believe that is the Hanafi school. But according to the Malikiyah, one has a choice to choose any which one of these 3 that he wants, but feeding the poor is better. Then he goes on to say, وَمَا وَصَلَ مِنْ غَيْرِ الْفَمِ إِلَى الْحَلْقِ مِنْ أُذْنٍ أَوْ أَنْفٍ أَوْ نَحْوِ ذَلِكَ وَلَوْ كَانَ بُخُورًا فَعَلَيْهِ الْقَضَاءُ فَقَطْ. Then he mentions here that if something were to enter the stomach or reach the stomach from other than the mouth, or my bad, if something were to reach the throat by other than the mouth, فَعَلَيْهِ الْقَضَاءُ فَقَط, then it is only obligatory on that person to make qada. And the examples that he gives you, for example, if water reaches your throat from the ears or from the nose, وَنَحْوِ ذَلِكَ, then it is only obligatory. Then it is only obligatory for a person to make qada and not kafara. So actually what the author is referring to here is he's referring to something that reaches the throat intentionally. So we just mentioned if a person were to eat and drink intentionally, then he would have to make kafara. But in this case, if something were to reach the throat from the ears or the nose, وَنَحْوِ ذَلِكَ, and anything like it, meaning any other part from the mouth, aside from the mouth, then وَلَوْ كَانَ بُخُورًا, even if it was smoke. And what do you mean smoke? Like smoke from food. فَعَلَيْهِ الْقَضَاءُ فَقَط, then it is obligatory for him to make qada faqat without having to make kafara. Then he mentions something here by saying وَمِثْلُهُ الْبَلْغَمُ الْمُمْكِنُ تَرْحُهُ. Then he mentions the spit in the mouth, this remaining spit that is in the mouth. If it was possible for a person to spit it out, if they were to swallow it, they would have to make qada, but that is a weak opinion in the school, and there's no practice by it. So even if a person were to swallow if the person were to swallow his spit, then it wouldn't be obligatory for him to make qada. And the same goes for the swallowing of, the same goes for the smoke. If a person were to take in smoke through the ears or so on and so forth, or through the nose, then it wouldn't nullify their fasting, and it's not obligatory for them to make qada. وَالْغَالِمُ مِنَ الْمَضْمَضَةِ وَالسِّوَاكِ وَكُلُّ مَا وَصَلَ إِلَى الْمَعِدَةِ وَلَوْ بِالْحُقْنَةِ الْمَائِعَةِ وَكَذَا مَنْ أَكَلَ بَعْدَ شَكِهِ فِي الْفَجْرِ لَيْسَ عَلَيْهِ فِي جَمِيعِ ذَلِكَ كُلُّهُ إِلَّا الْقَضَاء. Then he's going to give some more examples of things that necessitate qada but don't necessitate al-kafara. وَالْغَالِبُ مِنَ الْمَضْمَضَةِ وَالسِّوَاكِ. وَالْغَالِبُ مِنَ الْمَضْمَضَةِ means the water that reaches your mouth when you're washing it. So for example, you were washing your mouth with water and water went to the back of your throat by accident. Or siwak, or the juice from the miswak went down your throat, or maybe even the wood from the miswak went down your throat. Or وَكُلُّ مَا وَصَلَ إِلَى الْمَعِدَةِ, or anything that reaches the stomach, بِالْحُقْنَةِ الْمَائِئَةِ. What he means by بِالْحُقْنَةِ الْمَائِئَةِ is a type of, back in the older times, and I'm not sure if it still exists today, when there was a certain sickness inside the stomach, they used to inject something through the anus in order for the medicine to reach the stomach. If a person were fasting, technically speaking, if that were to reach his stomach, then he wouldn't be obligated. He wouldn't be obligated to do anything except make qada, and a person wouldn't be obligated to make kafara. And also, it should be known that even doing that act is disliked, but it is permissible when there's necessity. Meaning, when a person is sick and it's going to cure them, then it is permissible, but the origin of the rule is that it would be makruh if there was no reason. And then he says, وَكَذَا مَنْ أَكَلَ بَعْدَ شَكِّهِ فِي الْفَجْرِ. Also, a person who ate أَكَلَ بَعْدَ شَكِّهِ فِي الْفَجْرِ, a person who had shak, whether it was fajr or not. So a person ate, and while he was eating, he had shak whether it was fajr or not. Then that person would also have to make qada and not kafara. Same thing when it goes to having doubt in Maghrib. So for example, the person ate and then realized, I'm not really sure if I ate before Maghrib or after Maghrib. I think I ate early by an accident. Or the same thing for Fajr. Then this would necessitate that a person make qada, but it wouldn't be, a person wouldn't have to make, in this case, a person wouldn't have to make al-kafara. Then he goes to mention those things that don't necessitate qada, but the reason why he's mentioning them is because a person might assume that they have to make qada. So here he's just mentioning the things in order to clarify that these things don't necessitate qada. So he says, ولا يلزمه القضاء في غالب من ذباب أو غبار طريق أو دقيق أو كيل جبس لصانعه. يعني a person who swallowed a fly, for example, this happens for people who are outside and they were doing some type of work, and it mentions في غالب من ذباب, يعني were to swallow some type of flying, a fly or something like that, that wouldn't necessitate that their fast is broken. أو غبار الطريق, are the dust from the air. For example, in Middle Eastern countries, a lot of the time it's a lot of dust in the air, or you're working on a construction site, then inhaling the air would not nullify the fast. أو دقيق أو كيل جبس أو دقيق, and a person who's working in a dough factory, there's usually particles floating in the air, that also wouldn't nullify the fast. كيل جبس لصانعه, gypsum is plaster, but what they're referring to generally is one who weighs kayli gypsum lisani'ihi, like a person who works inside of a factory with substances that are present in the air. For example, like a person who works in a cement factory. When the cement bags and all that is moved around, then you usually have particles in the air. Breathing that in would not nullify one's fast at all either. وَلَا فِي حُقْنَةٍ مِّنْ إِحْلِيلٍ. And also we talked about the hukn that goes inside the anus, but what are the rectum. But in terms of one going into the genital section of a male, that wouldn't nullify the fast. وَلَا فِي دُهْنِ جَائِفَةٍ. Duhni ja'ifatin is when, let's say, a person had a stomach injury in which their stomachs were cut open. For example, somebody had an injury, they were stabbed or something in a hospital, and the duhn actually means a type of oil. So putting the oil inside the stomach, or any type of substance, here they're talking about something that existed in their time, or putting any type of substance in the stomach in order to cure it. For example, a person had a big gouge in his stomach and they put something in there in order to cure or to clean out, that would not be considered one of the things that nullify the fast.